Okay, so last time we met, we finished up talking about the male reproductive system, at least for now. We're going to pick up a little bit more with it here after we finish talking about the female reproductive system. Um, the very last thing that we talked about on whatever day that was, Monday, were the ovaries. Okay, the pair of glands where females produce their eggs or ova, as well as several hormones. Okay. The process in which females produce their eggs is called oogenesis, and that's what we're going to begin talking about here today. Um, Quite a bit more complicated than spermatogenesis, which we talked about the other day. Spermatogenesis, formation of sperm, doesn't begin in men until they hit puberty and continues throughout their entire lifespan. Females, oogenesis is the formation, development, and maturation of an ovum, which actually begins before a female is even born, but then takes a long kind of period where it's in kind of a timeout stage. So I'll get to kind of all that stuff. Begins with what's called an oocyte, which is an immature epithelial germ cell that migrates to the ovaries. So it actually comes from outside the ovaries. Comes here during early fetal development, and once inside those ovaries, they differentiate into oogonia. Oogonia is plural. Oogonium, which we see here on a couple figures here, a couple slides ahead. Oogonium, singular, there's one. Are diploid stem cells, which is why there was a two in the middle of the nucleus of those. Those divide mitotically, producing millions of germ cells, but most of those degenerate prior to a female even being born, a process called atresia. A few of them develop into larger cells known as primary oocytes or oocytes, which are the cells that enter prophase of meiosis, and this is all still during fetal development. Okay, so that primary oocyte is also diploid. Okay, because we haven't gone through meiosis one yet, but this is what begins meiosis one, and this is all once again during fetal development. Okay, but here's where the kind of craziness comes in. Prophase one is the very beginning of meiosis. It's the first stage. It starts, but it's not completed until after a female reaches puberty. So, like 10, 12 years until a female reaches puberty. This set of primary oocytes is going to just kind of hang out in that stage. During this arrested stage of development, each primary oocyte is surrounded by a single layer of flat follicular cells, and the entire structure is called a primordial follicle, which is our simplest of all the follicles. We see 4 different follicles. We'll get into all these here as we go through. We talked a little bit about the ovarian cortex there towards the end of class the other day. This is showing you at the kind of top left a couple of those primordial follicles. The egg cells inside, that's the primary oocyte, and then there's a single layer of what we call follicular cells surrounding it. And at birth, approximately 200,000 to 2 million of them remain, but by the time the female reaches puberty, only about 40,000 are still present. Around 400 of those will mature and ovulate during a woman's reproductive lifespan or lifetime. So they have 400 total opportunities basically to make a baby. And once they no longer have any, they are no longer able to, produce a child, produce offspring. Each month after puberty until they reach menopause, hormones from the anterior pituitary will stimulate the development of several, what we call, we just learned, primordial follicles, although only one will reach the maturity for ovulation. A few of them will start to grow, developing into what we call primary follicles, which consist of a primary oocyte surrounded by several layers of granulosa cells. So we are seeing that primary follicle. Nothing has changed as far as the egg yet. Okay, the egg is still inside, but now we are developing more and more layers of cells surrounding it, forming what's called a primary follicle. Okay. It then will mature into what's called a secondary follicle, which is a key stage because this is when we start to see the development of a space called an antrum, where what we call follicular fluid is secreted. Okay, so these granulosa cells begin to secrete follicular fluid, which builds up in the cavity at the center of the secondary follicle, known as the antrum. Okay, that secondary follicle will then mature and become the most mature follicle, which is why it's called a mature follicle. The other term for it is a Graafian follicle, which is a very important stage because this is the final stage of the bubble or follicle development before we see ovulation taking place. And just before ovulation, that diploid primary oocyte undergoes or completes, meiosis one, and we produce two haploid cells of unequal size, which is what this illustration here on the next page is showing you. Okay, here's our primary oocyte that we were just talking about, goes through meiosis one, forming two unequally sized cells, what we call a secondary oocyte and a first polar body. Notice here in the center of each of those, we now have the abbreviation or the symbol N, indicating that there are 23 chromosomes in each of these. As far as the two cells go, really the first polar body is unimportant. It will go through meiosis two, forming these two cells. But as you can see down here at the bottom, these cells, along with what we call a second polar body, are all just going to degenerate. So they really have no, important function. So we'll kind of focus our thoughts and efforts into understanding what's going to happen with the secondary oocyte. Okay, so going back to the previous page, larger cells known as the secondary oocyte, which receives most of the cytoplasm. And once formed, it begins meiosis two, but then it stops in metaphase two. So we see another kind of timeout. Okay? Mature follicle soon ruptures and releases its secondary oocyte, a process that we call ovulation. So it's not a diploid cell that's ovulated, it's a secondary oocyte, which is haploid. Okay? And that secondary oocyte is expelled into the pelvic cavity, or more specifically, it's expelled into what we call the fallopian tubes, oviducts, uterine tubes, whatever you want to call them. We'll talk a little bit more about those here after a bit. Okay, here's a key. So we're stuck here in metaphase two. Meiosis two is only going to resume with the oocyte only if the head of the sperm cell enters that secondary oocyte. Okay. If the oocyte is not fertilized, that ovum degenerates. If fertilization does take place, meiosis two will resume, which is why we show in this picture on the next page a sperm cell and a secondary oocyte coming together. Fertilization occurs, forming an ovum. Now, at this stage, we still show the N and the N separate. The N from the sperm and the N from the secondary oocyte are telling you there's 23 chromosomes, but they have not come together yet. Okay, remember, the chromosomes are in the nucleus. The cells are together, but the chromosomes have not completely come together. Okay. So, reading this bullet here, the secondary oocyte will split into two haploid cells, again of unequal size. The larger cell is the ovum or mature egg. The smaller cell is the second polar body. Once again, the second polar body, just like the first polar body, we'll forget about. Nuclei of the sperm and the ovum can then unite. What we call a zygote is formed. And notice here in the nucleus, we now show 2N, which means now that those chromosomes have come together, creating a single cell that is, half genetics coming from mom, half genetics coming from dad. Now, that's just specifically what's taking place with the egg out there, and that's all taking place at this point in the fallopian tubes. But going back into the ovaries, remember, think of this follicle structure that enclosed the egg like kind of like a balloon. Okay, it's popped, okay, but there's still a remnant of it left, and this is called a corpus luteum. Very, very important structure. It's just the remnants of the mature follicle, and it's important because it produces some very important hormones that regulate aspects of the female reproductive cycle. We're going to get into these hormones here in a little bit, but it includes progesterone, estrogens, which is plural on purpose, relaxin and inhibin. Well, we've talked about those previously. We'll get into them in a lot more detail here in just a second. Now, this structure will continue to produce those hormones for a little while, but if a female is not fertilized by an egg or by a sperm, in other words, if she's not technically pregnant, the structure will kind of just die off and become a scar tissue called the corpus albicans. If a female has her egg that was ovulated, fertilized, this structure will kind of last a little bit longer and continue to produce these hormones. And we'll get into all that here in a little bit. Okay. So I kind of referred more to this picture than this one. This one's essentially just showing you the exact same thing, but it's also showing what's going on with the follicle, the little bubble that's enclosing the egg. So that's kind of a handy thing. Not something I'm going to ask you to, specifically recite or anything like that. Just like I'm not going to make you do the same thing for spermatogenesis. Just kind of know the major points, know the differences between the two different, the 4 different follicles: primordial, primary, secondary, and mature. Know which one, the mature is what's ovulated. Know the, different cells, which is diploid, which are haploid, so on and so forth. Okay, so moving on from the ovaries and the oogenesis stuff that we just talked about, let's talk about the secondary female sex organs, one of which I've been talking quite a bit about already, the uterine tubes, also known as fallopian tubes or oviducts. Then there's the uterus, and then the vagina. Okay, the uterine tubes, also known as fallopian ducts or fallopian tubes, oviducts, active conduits for the ovum that we just talked about to reach the uterus. They transport that secondary oocyte away from the ovary and toward the uterus, and each uterine tube consists of 3 regions. Beginning what we call infundibulum, that contains pulsating cilia. So the cells have cilia to help draw that secondary oocyte into the tube after being expelled from the ovary. The ampulla is the widest and longest region, and something very important about it is it's typically the site of fertilization by sperm. And then the isthmus is a narrow region that leads to the uterus. Now, another name for the uterus is the womb. It is a thick muscular chamber that functions to harbor the fetus, which is why we call it a womb. It also provides a source of nutrition for that developing fetus and expels the fetus, or we could probably call it at this point, definitely could call it at this point, a baby at the end of its development. The wall of the uterus consists of 3 layers: an outer perimetrium that really, or metrium, perimetrium, that really just kind of helps hold the uterus in place. Probably the most important is, actually the other 2 are the other one is very important as well. The myometrium is super important because this is made up of muscle, smooth muscle specifically, that helps with childbirth. This is where the contractions that a female is going to experience as she's going into and through labor. The endometrium is very important. It's actually a double-layered membrane. It's a highly vascular mucosa, a lot of blood flows to it. And one of those 2 layers is shed each month when a female menstruates. And we'll get into all that stuff here as we get into the female reproductive cycle. Now, there's 3 parts to the uterus. There's a fundus at the top, there's a body in the middle, but kind of more importantly, physiologically, is the cervix. It's a narrow region at the bottom of the uterus that leads to the vagina. You hear about the cervix a lot when a female is going through the stages of labor, because this is what has to dilate or expand and open up to allow the baby out of the uterus and eventually out through the vagina so mom and dad can hold the baby. They say it goes from the width of like a pencil to, be able to expand all the way to allow the shoulders, kind of the widest point of a baby, out if a female is having, a traditional vaginal birth. So it can expand very, very prominently. And then it does, tend to go back to normal over time. Cervical mucus that's secreted in the cervix helps protect against bacteria from entering the uterus from the vagina. Speaking of the vagina, a tube that allows for discharge of menstrual fluid, receipt of the penis and semen, as well as birth of the baby. Okay, this is also sometimes called the birth canal. The vaginal wall consists of 3 layers: an adventitia, which is an outer layer that holds it in position. Muscularis is a middle layer consisting of 2 layers of smooth muscle, permitting expansion of it during childbirth and sexual intercourse. And then an inner mucosa, which there's glycogen stored by the mucosa cells of it that act on that glycogen, or bacteria act on that glycogen, which produces an acid solution. And overall, what's it going to do is lubricate and protect the vagina against other microbial infections. Okay, so we don't really get too much into detail with those structures. We're going to kind of bounce back and talk more about the ovaries as well as the uterus, which because those are important sites where changes take place each month as part of what we call her female reproductive cycle. Now, this is all during a female's reproductive years, and it's only specifically taking place for non-pregnant females. These are cyclical changes we can describe as specific to the ovaries, what we call the ovarian cycle, and it occurs during and after the maturation of an oocyte. And then what's typically called the menstrual cycle is specific to what's going on in the uterus. What we call the uterine cycle is a concurrent series of changes specific to that endometrium that I just mentioned, the inner lining of the uterus, which is helpful to prepare it for the arrival of possibly a fertilized ovum. So possibly a baby coming in and implanting in the wall and starting to grow. Female reproductive cycle encompasses both the ovarian and uterine cycles, as well as the hormonal changes that regulate them and the related cyclical changes in the breasts and cervix. This lasts about 28 days, which is right around a month, and includes 4 phases. Now, before we get into the phases, let's talk about the hormones that are part and help regulate this cycle. Okay, a lot of hormones to be discussed here. As you can see, we can trace it back as far as hormones go to the brain, just like we could with the what we call brain testicular axis that we talked about the other day. The first hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, is that same hormone that helped regulate spermatogenesis in men. GnRH is a hormone from the hypothalamus that controls both the ovarian and uterine cycles in females. It stimulates the release of FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary. And we've talked about all that before. FSH is, as I said, a hormone secreted by the anterior pituitary, and its job, it's based pretty much straightforward based on its name, follicle stimulating hormone. Where follicles, we go back to it, are those bubbles that we were talking about. Okay? So follicle stimulating hormone initiates follicular growth, so growth of the follicles, stimulates them to secrete the hormones known as estrogens that we'll get into. So hopefully pretty straightforward based on its name. Luteinizing hormone is another hormone secreted by the anterior pituitary, and it stimulates further development of the ovarian follicles, stimulates them to secrete estrogens, stimulates developing follicles to produce androgens. Probably one of the most important things, and something I would definitely have you guys highlight, is that it triggers ovulation, which is where that bubble bursts. The secondary oocyte is pushed out into the fallopian tubes, and that bubble that is broken becomes what's called a corpus luteum. And, estrogens are a group of hormones secreted by ovarian follicles, and they have several functions. One second. Okay, so estrogens is a plural set of hormones, all produced by those developing ovarian follicles, and they have several functions. They promote the development and maintenance of the female reproductive structures. So, the stuff that we just talked about, along with the, external genitalia, the clitoris and that kind of stuff that we don't really want to, or need to get into. As well as secondary sex characteristics that really start to blossom when a female hits puberty, development of the breasts and pubic hair and that kind of stuff. Estrogens also increase protein anabolism, and that includes building strong bones, helps lower blood cholesterol, and inhibits the release of GnRH, LH, and FSH. And that's kind of like what we talked about with testosterone. When testosterone levels got high, it's it stopped the release of GnRH and LH. Here, this is the same thing. When estrogen levels are high, it's going to stimulate, it's going to inhibit the release of these hormones. Progesterone is secreted mainly by cells of that corpus luteum. Remember, that's the leftover remnant of the bubble after it bursts, after ovulation takes place. It works with estrogens to prepare and maintain the endometrium for possibly implantation and mammary glands for milk production. So progesterone is going to help prepare a mom for the possibility of having a baby. Implantation is where that fertilized egg will stick to the wall in the uterus and then begin, to develop. Okay. Relaxin, released as well by the corpus luteum during each monthly cycle, helps relax the uterus by inhibiting contractions of the myometrium, and at the end of pregnancy, increases flexibility of the pubic symphysis, which is that little piece of cartilage between the two hip bones. So the hip bones are able to kind of separate a little bit more, and dilates the uterine cervix, so allows for childbirth essentially to kind of start to take place. Inhibin, secreted by granulosa cells of the growing follicles and by the corpus luteum after ovulation, does exactly what its name implies. It inhibits, in this case, secretion of FSH, as well as to a lesser extent LH. So a lot of hormones and a lot of kind of craziness with those hormones. So let's talk about what those hormones do for a female as far as the reproductive cycle. As I said, reproductive cycle or female reproductive cycle consists of both things going on in the ovaries and in the uterus. So what I've done here is for the 4 different phases or stages, I've tried to give you information about what's taking place specific to the ovaries as well as specific to the uterus. Now, these are the first 2 stages. The final stages or phases are listed here on the following page. Okay, let's bounce back to days 1 through 5, what we call the menstrual phase, which is really a term that's referring to what's taking place with the uterus. But let's start with talking about what's taking place in the ovaries. Under the influence of follicle-stimulating hormone, several primordial follicles are developing into primary follicles and then into secondary follicles. Remember, we're just developing the bubbles. More cells are being formed, and the kind of wall of that bubble is getting thicker. This process takes several months, though, which means that a follicle begins this one in one cycle will not mature for several cycles later. In the uterus, this is when a female is having menstrual discharge, or as they say, she's on her period. And this is because of declining levels of estrogens and progesterone, stimulating the release of prostaglandin chemicals that cause the uterine spiral arterioles to constrict, causing cells to be deprived of oxygen, leading to their death. So essentially, one of the layers of cells is not getting the nutrients that it needs, and they're going to die off, and so that's where the bleeding comes from. Upon completion of this phase, only the stratum basalis of the endometrium remains. The stratum functionalis is the layer that's being shed. Stage 2 or phase 2 is what we call the pre-ovulatory phase. Pre, remember, means before, so this is the time before ovulation. It's between the end of menstruation and ovulation, and it's about a week, days 6 through 13. In the ovaries, some of the secondary follicles are beginning to secrete estrogens and inhibin. By about day 6, a secondary follicle in one of the ovaries has outgrown all the others and has become what we call the dominant follicle. Estrogens and inhibin secreted by the dominant follicle will decrease FSH, causing other follicles to stop growing. Now, in some cases, 2 or 3 secondary follicles can become what we call codominant, and if ovulated and fertilized, this can result in what's called fraternal or non-identical twins that don't look exactly alike and don't necessarily have to be the same sex. Normally, though, one dominant follicle will become that mature Graafian follicle that is ovulated, okay, because twins are not a kind of typical thing in humans. We don't have litters like other animals where a bunch of eggs are being released And like with dogs, when they make puppies, they don't usually just have one. In the ovarian cycle, both the menstrual and preovulatory phases we would call the follicular phase, because this is when the follicles are growing. In the uterus, during these 6 to 13 days, estrogens released by that growing ovarian follicles stimulate the repair of the endometrium. So we shed it during the menstrual phase and we start to grow it back here in this preovulatory phase. Cells of the stratum bacillus undergo mitosis, forming that new stratum functionalis, and the thickness of the endometrium will double. Specifically for the uterine cycle, we call the preovulatory phase the proliferative phase because the endometrium is proliferating or growing through cell division. Okay, about smack dab in the middle of the cycle, day 14 is when a female ovulates, which is the rupture of that mature Graafian follicle and the subsequent release of that secondary oocyte into the fallopian tubes. This is caused by a peak or highest levels of estrogens exerting a positive feedback effect on the cells that secrete LH and gonadotropin releasing hormone. Remember, LH was that hormone most specifically involved with causing ovulation. After that, we call this the post-ovulatory phase. Remember, post means after. So this is the last 14 or so days of the 28-day cycle, days 15 to 28. Events in the ovary after ovulation, the mature follicle stimulates that formation of the corpus luteum under the influence of LH. And as we learned earlier, that bubble structure that's formed, that's the remnant called the corpus luteum, secretes those very important hormones that we just learned about. If we're specifically talking about the ovarian cycle, we would call this the luteal phase, probably because it's involving the luteum. Now, if that oocyte is not fertilized, this luteum will last about 2 weeks before degenerating into that scar structure that I talked about earlier, called the corpus albicans. As the levels of progesterone, estrogens, and inhibin decrease, the release of gonadotropin releasing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone rise due to the loss of negative feedback. And the follicular growth resumes as the new ovarian cycle would begin. If the oocyte is fertilized, that corpus luteum lasts more than 2 weeks. Okay, and that's because of a new hormone that a female is going to be producing. And really, it's not the female, it's the growing embryo, okay, that growing baby. And we're going to call this hormone human chorionic gonadotropin, okay, because it's produced by the chorion of that embryo, which is something I'm not going to really kind of get into too much. HCG prevents that corpus luteum from degenerating and forming the corpus albicans, and that's going to allow those levels of progesterone, estrogens, relaxin, and inhibin to continue to be, elevated. HCG is an important hormone, obviously, for this, but this is what's actually tested when a female pees on a stick when they want to find out if they are pregnant, and it's a perfect way to do it because the female's only going to be testing positive if she's got a growing embryo inside, or at least it should be. Okay. In the uterus, progesterone and estrogens produced by that corpus luteum will promote further growth of the endometrium so that it's going to be back to normal. Because of the secretory activity of the endometrial glands in the endometrium, this is called the secretory phase of the uterine cycle. Changes peak about 1 week after ovulation, when a fertilized ovum might arrive in the uterus. If that fertilization does not occur, the levels of progesterone and estrogens decline due to that degenerated corpus luteum. And withdrawal of estrogens and progesterone would be what causes menstruation, and we'd start the whole process back over again. And I should not say we because I'm not a woman, and this is not something I experience. Now, that is obviously a long-winded description of what's taking place. A lot to talk about, a lot to kind of wrap your head around. This is a figure, actually it's 2 figures that I've kind of combined into one. Letter A is, basically all of this, and then letter B is specifically showing you the hormones of the anterior pituitary and the ovaries. And I really kind of tried to match it up as best I can to what's taking place in this case in the uterus, as well as back up in here for the ovaries. So, you know, you can see the 5 phases are labeled, or excuse me, the 4 phases are labeled. Said days 1 through 5 are called the menstrual phase. This is when a female's losing that inner lining of her endometrium, okay, where it's being shed because the cells are not receiving the nutrients that they are needing. During this stage is when we see the follicles developing, and remember this takes several months, so it that won't necessarily be or won't be this all the way to this in one specific cycle. By the time the primary, secondary, and mature follicles have developed, they start producing estrogens, and as we trace our line here, we can see estrogen levels are going up. Pre-ovulatory phase begins days 6 through 13. We'll look what happens to the uterus. It's starting to grow back. Okay. Day 14, when LH peaks, is when a female ovulates. Okay. That egg is released into the fallopian tubes. The follicle becomes that corpus luteum, which produces progesterone and estrogens. And as we see, progesterone in our red line is going to go up. Estrogens aren't quite as elevated as they were before ovulation, but they are still a little bit elevated, which peaks about a week after ovulation. Remember, ovulation was day 14. So about day 22 or so is when progesterone and estrogens are elevated. Now, this is going to continue to produce those hormones unless a female does not get pregnant. In that case, the corpus albicans is the structure that forms, but this is what will continue to release those hormones if a female is releasing that HCG that we talked about, which is produced by the embryo itself. Okay. So when the corpus albicans is formed from this degenerating corpus luteum, look what happens to progesterone and estrogen. Okay, those levels are going to drop, and as I just said, the withdrawal of those hormones is going to trigger menstruation to start over again. So, a lot going on, but rightfully so. Females, you can pat yourself on the back. It is amazing what you guys go through each month, and without it, we would not be able to make babies. Looking at this figure here on the next page, one of the probably most complicated figures we have in the entire textbook and all the notes we've referred to. It shows you all the different interactions with the hormones, seeing here what's going on with the ovaries, specifically with the follicles. Down here at the bottom, they're kind of talking about what's going on with the uterus. I'm not going to kind of refer to it. If you want to kind of look through things, you can. There's negative feedback stuff. There's positive feedback stuff. Really, I included it because it's in your textbook, but I think I might just confuse you even more if I start to try to break it down for you. So with that said, we will move on to talking about fertilization some more. Okay. Remember, fertilization is where that sperm penetrates and unites with the nucleus of the egg. Before we talk about fertilization, though, I want to talk about fertility. Okay. Fertility you can think of as just the ability to fertilize an egg. Okay. Or for an egg to become fertilized. So let's talk about factors that affect male fertility, and then we'll talk about factors that affect female fertility. One of the most important factors that affects a male's fertility is the amount of sperm that they produce. Okay. A low count of sperm and or a high proportion of abnormal sperm is a major cause of sterility, which sterility or being sterile means that they are not, likely to get a female pregnant. Okay. It's kind of crazy because a person that still produces and releases over or less, around 20 million sperm per milliliter, that's, seems like a lot, but it's not going to be enough to actually have one of those sperm cells reach and fertilize that egg. A normal count would be around 100 million per milliliter, which is pretty crazy. Now that sperm number is actually affected by several things. Ejaculation frequency. The more ejaculations a man has in a day, the less and less sperm he's going to be releasing each time, which is probably pretty common sense. If he's ejaculating a whole bunch, his sperm number is going to, get less and less and less because, he's just not able to keep up. And so, if a man ejaculates the first time, that would probably be the most likely time that a man would get a female pregnant. High temperatures, we talked about this earlier in the lecture. We said that sperm prefer to be stored and form a little bit lower than our core body temperature, around 32, 34, somewhere in that neighborhood, which is a little bit less than that 37 degrees Celsius. If the testes are kept inside the body or too close to it, sperm formation ceases. So things like tight clothing, like, tighty whities that, people wear, compression shorts that keep the testes and the scrotum from, hanging lower, can result in low sperm counts. 30 minutes just sitting in a hot bath or like a hot tub can lead to a decrease of about 90% in sperm number. Other factors could be excess consumption of alcohol, major stress, malnutrition, certain drugs can reduce sperm count and fertility. Radiation decreases male fertility, which is a big reason why when a man has, like an x-ray, they put a lead vest over his waist, covering his testes. And sperm production is higher in winter, regardless of scrotum temperature. Never really kind of researched why. I guess maybe, I was just joking. It's cold outside. Might as well stay in and make babies, I guess. Okay, factors that affect a female's ability to get pregnant. Um, the age of the sperm and the egg play a role. Sperm in the female tract undergo aging but remain motile, be able to swim, and have the ability to fertilize an egg for up to 4 days. So that's kind of crazy. They're most likely to fertilize an egg really shortly after the act of sex, but it can take place a few days later. Freshly ovulated eggs are the mature and best for fertilization for about 12 hours after ovulation. So that's why you hear about people, wanting to get pregnant, having lots and lots of sex on ovulation day. Therefore, or thereafter, eggs gradually age and become less likely to be fertilized. It's not out of the realm of possibility for a female to get pregnant way away from her ovulation day, but it's most likely to happen around ovulation. The age of the female, fertility is highest in females in their 20s and early 30s, declining beyond their late 30s to very low levels in their 40s. And it ceases around age 50 when a female reaches what they call menopause. Menopause is characterized by the cessation of menstrual cycles, ovulation, fertility, and pregnancy. Hormone intervention, injections of gonadotropins, LH, FSH, or HCG would enhance the number of follicles developing in the ovaries as well as the chances of their ovulation, something that people might have done, ladies might have done if they are struggling to get pregnant. And I could have listed contraceptives for men and how that affects fertility, but you guys are all probably aware more females use contraceptives, like the birth control pill and diaphragms and that kind of stuff. Overall function of a contraceptive is to aim to reduce fertility or the chance of pregnancy by preventing things like ovulation, the encounter of sperm and egg, fertilization, or implantation. Like the birth control prevents ovulation from taking place. Like a condom obviously is going to reduce the chance that a sperm can find an egg. The day after pill, as they like to call it, or plan B, prevents implantation. So there's all sorts of different ways and methods to prevent a female from, developing a baby. Oral contraceptives containing synthetic estrogen and progesterone inhibit the release of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which is what prevents follicular growth and ovulation. 1 second. All right, hang on 1 second, guys. All right. So now that we have an idea of what affects fertility, we can move on into actually talking about fertilization. Fertilization is the penetration of a secondary oocyte by a sperm cell. So it should say of a secondary oocyte by a sperm cell, which results in meiotic division of that secondary oocyte, forming an ovum. Remember, meiosis II only is able to be completed if that sperm cell penetrates the egg, and that ovum that is formed is just before the nuclei of those sperm unite, forming a single diploid cell called a zygote. Okay? Diploid meaning that the 23 and the 23 chromosomes have come together. Fertilization generally occurs in those uterine or fallopian tubes within 12 to 24 hours after ovulation, kind of going back to what I was just talking about. Sperm that reach the vicinity of the oocyte within minutes after ejaculation are actually not capable of fertilizing it until about 7 hours later. This is because they must undergo that process called capacitation, which I said we would talk about the other day. Capacitation is a series of functional changes causing the sperm's tail to beat even more vigorously and prepare its plasma membrane to fuse with the oocyte's plasma membrane. For fertilization to occur, a sperm cell must penetrate 2 layers. These are layers that surround the oocyte: a corona radiata, which is a set of granulosa cells around the oocyte, and a zona pellucida, which is a clear glycoprotein layer between the radiata and the oocyte's plasma membrane. So these are kind of protective layers. That enzyme that we talked about the other day, that's on the front of the head of the sperm, called acrosome, is going to release the enzymes and help penetrate the cells of the radiata, where it then can come into contact with the pellucida. A sperm can then bind to a receptor called the sperm receptor ZP3. I don't know why it's named that, but that's what its name is. And once bound with that egg plasma membrane, the egg plasma membrane engulfs the sperm. This is the main stage of fertilization. So basically, the sperm sticks to the pellucida at that receptor ZP3, and then the egg kind of just sucks it in, it engulfs it. A zonal reaction is a rapid chemical modification of the pellucida that prevents or blocks the penetration by any more sperm, which would result in way too many chromosomes coming into the nucleus, and the cell would not be a viable cell. Once a sperm cell enters the secondary oocyte, the oocyte must first complete its meiosis II. Nucleus in the head of the sperm develops into what's called a male pronucleus. The nucleus of the fertilized ovum develops into a female pronucleus. Then they fuse. We call this pronuclei fusion. And what results is the chromosomes come together. We call this recombination. And the male and female gametes form what's called the zygote, that diploid cell. Now, we talked earlier about fraternal twins. Another term for fraternal twins are dizygotic twins. Di, remember, means two. So dizygotic literally just kind of translates to mean 2 zygotes. And this is possible because a female can release 2 secondary oocytes or ovulate 2 egg cells, and fertilization can take place by separate sperm. Now that's going to cause, the formation of, twins that aren't perfectly alike as far as appearance. They don't even necessarily have to be the same sex. Okay, just like having 2 kids at the same time. Monozygotic, remember mono means one. So one zygote is what identical twins come from. This is going to be where a single fertilized ovum occurs, and then it splits in half. And so identical twins have exactly the same DNA and are always going to be the same sex. And they develop when the separation of the developing cells forms 2 embryos. So it is kind of a cool thing, and it's pretty rare. My sister just had identical twins this past summer. My dad's an identical twin, so I've got them in my family. There's a lot of genetics, I think, that play a role in it, but I won't get into it any more than that. Okay, about 24 hours later after fertilization, so about a day after, we see mitosis taking place rapidly. We call this cleavage. We can see the stages of it taking place over on the right. By the end of the third day, we've gone from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 cells. Okay, and we're showing here this structure is called a morula, which is a solid ball of cells. Okay, which then forms a cavity internal to it, which we call that structure a blastocyst. Okay, and a blastocyst here you can see is a hollow ball of cells because of that cavity that forms, which is a very important stage of development because this is what attaches to the endometrium in a process we call implantation. So in other words, this is where it sticks to the wall of the uterus and will begin, you know, forming into that more mature baby. The blastocyst now consists of two parts: the inner cell mass, which becomes the fetus, and a surrounding membrane known as the chorion, which will become part of the placenta. Remember we talked about HCG earlier, human chorionic gonadotropin, that hormone that people or females have a test for to find out if they're pregnant. That's the chorion now we were talking about, where that comes from. Placenta is a special structure through which the exchange of nutrients and wastes between the fetal and maternal, or mom and baby's circulations occur. It is also known as afterbirth because this is what's pushed out of mom after she's pushed out the baby in labor. The umbilical cord is an actual connection between the placenta and the fetus. It connects to the baby's umbilicus, which is just the remnant or scar tissue that's left over, also known as the navel, or we probably best call it the belly button. About 15 days after fertilization, gastrulation takes place. Okay. Gastrulation is very important because this is where the three primary germ or tissue layers develop, what we call the ecto, the meso, and the endoderm. Okay, and the ecto, the meso, and endoderm eventually form the following structures. Okay, now hopefully you guys can kind of read yours okay. I don't know why they color coded it like they did. Kind of makes it hard to read if you print it off in black and white. But I definitely kind of want you to study these different layers. So make sure that for example, a lot of the linings of our different organ systems that we talked about, the inside of the tracts come from the endoderm. That's the innermost germ layer, which makes sense. The meso is the middle layer. That's where a lot of the different structures come from, your bones and your muscles and that kind of stuff. And then, like your skin, epidermis, specifically of the skin, the nervous tissue, all that stuff comes from the ectoderm, the outer layer of our primary germ layers. Figure up here on the top is just showing you the stages eventually leading to implantation that we talked about on that previous page. Last thing I want to talk about, and we got just a little bit of time here, we can finish this real quick, is organogenesis, which, based on the name, tells you exactly what's taking place. Begins with the word organ, ends with genesis. Genesis means to form. Organ begins the word, so it's formation of organs. Okay. The 4th through the 8th weeks of development are very significant in embryonic development because all major organs appear during this time. The term organogenesis refers to the formation of body organs and systems. So early, talking all first trimester here. By the end of the 8th week, all those major body systems have begun to develop, although their functions for the most part are pretty minimal. By the middle of the 4th week, upper limb buds develop, begin to develop. Lower limb buds and the heart prominence form. At the end of the 4th week, an embryo has a tail. During the 5th week, our brain and head develop rapidly and the limbs develop further. By the 7th week, regions of the limbs become distinct and digits appear. By the end of the 8th week, eyelids come together, the tail disappears, at least it's supposed to. External genitalia is beginning to develop and differentiate. So which we can, at this point, almost kind of tell if we're, having a baby boy or baby girl. Digits are distinct and are no longer webbed. The final period of the fetus's life is called the fetal period. This is the 9th week until birth. So the last little bit of the first trimester through the 2nd and 3rd trimesters. During this time, tissues and organs that develop during embryonic period grow and differentiate. Very few structures appear, but the rate of body growth is remarkable, especially in the last half of intrauterine life. Table 29.2 just kind of breaks it down, showing you what's kind of taking place. Not something I ask you to know, but it's kind of cool to see when things are coming together. So with that said, that wraps this up, and we can stop here.